Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 9, where we're going to take a look at intelligence and terrorism. Before we jump into our lecture this morning, and we do have a lot of content to cover, I wanted to make this available to you. This is a 3-part series, and it's only about 10 to about 15 minutes per video, and we have 3 videos. That's the actual visual documentary, if you will, on President Obama and the killing of Osama bin Laden. And it does bring to light a lot of very interesting concepts. And it will actually help add context to many chapters that we're talking about in this course. So if you have time, this would be a great thing for you to take a moment and watch these 3 different videos. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into our lecture. So the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001 had a major impact on national homeland security policies and law enforcement strategies at the federal, state, and the local levels. And a recent report indicates that there are over 1,271 government organizations and 1,931 private organizations involved in homeland security, intelligence gathering, and even counterterrorism issues. So there's a lot of information out there. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, alone has contributed more than $500 million toward the development of new local and state agencies centered on the goal of improving coordination of policies through intelligence sharing. And we've talked a little bit in prior chapters about what intelligence and information is, right? So we kind of know that, or we should know that by now. Now, a deficiency that was quickly identified following 9/11, or the 9/11 attacks, was that coordination and intelligence sharing between agencies and different levels of government was very, I mean, it was really bad, but it was almost non-existent. So several post 9/11 studies have been critical of the U.S. intelligence community's ability to collect and analyze important intelligence information on different terrorist groups. Now, the most important of these inquiries was known as the Gilmore Commission, named after Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore, chair of the congressionally sponsored commission to assess the domestic response of federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies against terrorism between 1999 and 2003. And this report basically outlines 5 key issues, or identified 5 key issues that were problematic or just plain old problems. So let's take a look at these. So number 1 was the failure to emphasize human intelligence in favor of an over-reliance on technological tools, things like satellites and computer programs. So not really taking into account what the individuals are telling you, but relying on other types of data. Number 2, failure to provide timely, accurate, and specific intelligence information to law enforcement agencies. And this is sometimes problematic when you're dealing with different agencies. Say you have a federal agency and a state agency. A lot of times the information really doesn't get shared as often and as quickly as it should. Number 3, an overly bureaucratic and decentralized structure. So, and kind of what they mean by that is, particularly, you know, when you talk about the FBI, and they basically hindered some counterterrorism efforts in this because they weren't really sharing information. Number 4, outdated and obsolete computer systems that prevented the timely sharing of critical information with and between law enforcement agencies. And then finally, number 5, overly restrictive guidelines and laws that basically hindered the effective use of informants and intelligence gathering of terrorists. So all of these were basically, some key problems or issues. Now, complicating these 5 potential problems is the structure of the American government, which includes the cities and counties, what form, local government, state governments, and federal governments. And along with that, just what responsibilities should each of these different levels of government have? To kind of illustrate, should acts of terrorism be investigated only by the FBI and the appropriate state and or local law enforcement agencies? Should basically vetting or ferreting out terrorist plots be the exclusive jurisdiction of the CIA or the military? And within the military, which one of those units should be involved? So here the answers to these questions really aren't that simple. But we're going to take a look. We're going to define the role and the scope of intelligence in combating terrorism. And we're also going to take a look at the various agencies that make up what's called the U.S. intelligence community. So again, a lot of different terms and definitions, etc. But hang in there, and you're going to do great. Now, this is the report. There's an actual book that was published that has a lot of this information. But this, the 9/11 Commission report, this is the final report of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States. And you can actually pick it up at a bookstore if, you would like to take a look at it or read it. And you might even be able to find portions of it online. So, with that said, what is intelligence? And we've learned this definition, or we should have, in previous chapters. But when you just look it up on the web or in a dictionary, here's a couple of definitions. The ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. And it talks, single words, synonyms are intellect or mind or judgment, understanding, comprehension. And then the second definition is the collection of information of military or political value. So some of the synonyms here are a little bit different. Surveillance, observation, reconnaissance, because these are things that are done, even spying and espionage. These are things that are done in order to obtain intelligence or information, and then you synthesize it and it becomes intelligence, right? Okay, so let's define it. So the term intelligence often refers to information that is significant or relevant to an impending event, meaning something that's coming up, that will be a contribution to the positive outcome of that specific event. So, information basically is nothing more than data that has yet to be screened and interpreted or processed or analyzed through some type of professional analysis or process. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then once information has been analyzed, then it may become intelligence. So hopefully, we've defined this a little bit. Now, so intelligence then, if we're going to, kind of hone down the definition, is a product, the outcome, right? The product derived from systematic and thoughtful examination, placed in context and provided to governmental executives and military leaders with facts and alternatives that can inform critical decisions. Wow, that just seems like a big, huge definition. Now, there are two important things here. The key is the analysis of the information And then remember that intelligence is a process, and a product. So here's a shorter definition. Intelligence is an information process and product derived from systematic and thoughtful analysis. So I know a lot of these, big words and legalese and definitions and phrases, but it's good that we're actually kind of defining all of this. So again, intelligence, before we kind of move on, is both a process and a product. And information is collected and analyzed, and a finding is produced to meet the needs of a specific customer, whoever is wanting the intelligence. And then we're going to look at some sources in just a minute, but I wanted to kind of give you a little exercise. So this is information and intelligence. So I'm going to read something to you and follow along. And when you think you know what it is, what I'm describing to you, just, kind of take note. And we'll see kind of, how long it takes you in my reading here before you can figure it out. So here we go. It was invented in 1938 by the Hungarian inventor George Biro. While they come in many styles, colors, and configurations, they are easily reloaded by anyone who can use one. Simply pick up the device and grasp the lower barrel firmly between the thumb and forefinger of either hand and twist counterclockwise while holding tightly to the upper barrel in a similar manner with the other hand. Slowly twist the two components counterclockwise while applying slight pressure between the barrels to avoid dropping any internal components. The refill is located inside the hollow cylinders of the upper and lower barrels and held between the front spring and the back spring, which in turn is held under a plunger. To reload the device, simply pull the upper and lower barrels apart while carefully avoiding dropping any internal components. Avoid contact with the point of the refill to prevent permanent stains of clothing and other absorbent materials. Slide the upper barrel assembly away from the remaining components and place aside. Remove the old refill component and discard. Insert a fresh refill into the lower barrel and repeat the steps in reverse order to reassemble. Holy moly. Now, when did you figure out what it is? Or have you figured it out yet? So sometimes, this information, until we synthesize it, it doesn't make any sense, because what we're talking about is a pen. And here's a picture of a cross-section of a pen. So we said all of that, like 2 minutes of stuff, when I could have just showed you a picture. So again, that's part of the process of using the right words, using the right information, analyzing your information appropriately. So kind of a cool exercise, and I hope you gained a little insight. Here's another really quick one. And a lot of times I'll give this to members of our SWAT team that are trying out for the team to see how they think. So look at these two photos. It's the front side and the back side, the heads and tails of a quarter. I'll give you a second to kind of look at it. And now we're going to go here. So now I want you to, in your mind, or write on a piece of paper, however you want. We're not going to take too long for this. Tell me some basic observations about that quarter. And basically, what this exercise does is it starts to categorize those who are, let's say, just visual and tactile observers. Then those that are visual, tactile observers coupled with some knowledge because they know a little bit about it, or inferences, or they're drawing a conclusion, an inference. Or the third category is those that have detailed knowledge, and they're insightful, and they can even come up with a hypothesis. So what do I mean? These are basic things about the quarter. It's round. The word liberty's on it. There's an image of an eagle on it. The quarter is made of metal. And the coin contains both English and Latin words. Now, if you have a little bit of knowledge, you kind of go up another rung. And the eagle is the official bird of the U.S. It takes 4 quarters to equal $1. You kind of get what I mean? And then you go to those that kind of look a little bit way out there into stuff. The quarter is 91.67% copper and 8.33% nickel. I wouldn't have known that anyway. But you can see the difference in how people process things. And there are those that are basic, those that are kind of intermediate, and those that are kind of advanced when it comes to, interpretation, etc. So hopefully, again, those exercises kind of brought forth a little bit of insightful information. Okay, so where are now some sources from which intelligence can be gathered? Now, here are some kind of weird acronyms. Okay, and these are all sources of where intelligence can be gathered. So humans, right, they can provide intelligence, and their acronym is HUMINT, and I didn't make these up, so don't go, oh, how come it's not just, because I didn't do it. Signals, which would be SIGINT, geospatial, technical, imagery, photographs, and open source. So, keep in mind that intelligence can be used for broad purposes. For example, shaping policy or doctrine. In those applications, intelligence is not time sensitive, but in others it may be. And on rare occasions, during the Vietnam War, a Viet Cong defector would reveal where prisoners of war or POWs were being held. Now, because those camps were often moved, raids had to be launched quickly. And that situation describes tactical intelligence, which is perishable and therefore requires some type of rapid action. But again, these are sources from which intelligence can be gathered. And then there's something called counterintelligence. So on the other hand, counterintelligence, or CI for short, includes the activities, analysis, and decisions to prevent adversaries from acquiring information about an organization's capabilities, intentions, personnel, and plans. So that's the definition of counterintelligence. And counterintelligence is used to, again, as I said, to disrupt the activities and operations of terrorist groups. So pre-9/11, the Taliban ruled Afghanistan and had a substantial human intelligence collection capability. They had 20,000 spies and well over 100,000 informants, at least one on every block, as well as in hospitals, military units, and aid agencies. So that's how they gleaned or obtained a lot of their information from actual individuals. So that's an example of the a source of information, that being humans, or the HUMINT. Now, following the 9/11 attacks, the Taliban refused to hand over Osama bin Laden, and the United States and its allies waged war on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And these groups, these human groups, also helped hide Osama bin Laden. So again, you can see how they used these, the human factor. And I have a really cool video if you're interested. It's titled "Inside the Raid," and it shows inside of the compound where bin Laden was tracked down to. It's actually a pretty cool video. So if you have time, take a look at it. I also have a 60 minutes link to the 60-minute special, Inside the Killing of bin Laden. So all of these, they're not mandatory. They're just good information, and they share a lot of the intelligence and also the counterintelligence efforts. So it kind of helps add some context to the chapter to get you to understand these two definitions. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the U.S., the intel or intelligence community itself. So in order to address the problems identified by the Gilmore Commission, remember that report, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act was formed. And I have kind of a picture of it there. And I also put the little seals or the patches so you can see how these two relate. But these are actual reports that you can even pull up online. And the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 also established the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So, and you'll start to see how this community starts to build up. So here again, we have the formation of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. And this act actually established the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence also added some additional groups or teams or units or programs. So one thing it did is it centralized all of the intelligence information. It added 16 federal agencies that are responsible for national security, and they report directly to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And these agencies, these 16 federal agencies that I'm talking about, these agencies are known as the intelligence community. And there's quite a few of them. So again, and we'll talk a little bit more about all of these, as we kind of go through this lecture, if you will. So the primary purpose of this new structure is to better coordinate, integrate, and manage the collection, analysis, and also the dissemination, the putting out of intelligence information that relates to threats that are posed by terrorists. And here's kind of an example. So it's in your textbook. It's figure 9.2. It's on page 249. But you can see up at the top, we have the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Then you have some of the program managers here. You have some other departments, and then you have some services. So this is the intelligence community that's underneath or under the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, right? So just kind of in summary, really quick, just so we're on track and we don't forget. So these 16 agencies here represent the primary groups of federal government responsible for national security, including each branch of the military: Air Force, Army, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps. The primary national intelligence agencies, National Security Agency and the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency. And also federal law enforcement, so the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Department of Homeland Security. And these agencies and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, again, are referred to as the intel or the intelligence community of the United States. So the primary purpose, again, of this structure that you're looking at is to better coordinate, integrate, and manage the collection, analysis, and dissemination of intelligence information, including the intelligence that relates directly to international and domestic threats posed by terrorism. So there's your group. And here's maybe a better slide that really lists everything in the U.S. intelligence community. So it has the patch or the logo, if you will. So in the middle is, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, right? And then this is one of the logos or the patch, if you will, for each one of these agencies. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit more sense when you can see it visually. Okay, so let's kind of continue on. So the ODNI also administers the National Intelligence Program. okay, or what we call the NIP, which funds the intelligence activities of the entire federal government. And the estimated 2017 budget is nearly $54 billion per year and is critical in strengthening the nation's intelligence agencies. So you can see that there's a lot of money and a lot of information flowing. So the National Counterterrorism Center serves as the national and international hub for intelligence activity. And it also serves as a single point for strategic and operational planning of counterterrorism activity. Now, keep in mind, as we go through these different agencies, you don't have to remember every one of these. Even though we're going to just, we're going to cover them briefly, but don't panic about trying to remember the name of every single agency that falls under there. You may want to remember a couple of the big ones like the FBI or the CIA, but you don't have to remember every single one. So just a little kind of point of reference there. So again, we're still talking about the National Counterterrorism Center. They serve as a single point for strategic and operational planning of counterterrorism activity. And they also operate a secure website for the FBI and their Joint Terrorist Task Force, and it's called the JTTF. Military Combatant Commands and the Joint Counterterrorism Assessment Team, which is JCAT. Now, the only group that you might run into at a basic law enforcement level is the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Because if you see here, remember, this National Counterterrorism Center operates this website for the FBI's Joint Terrorist Task Force. Well, there's an FBI office in several different, counties. And in California, we actually have one in Riverside. So when I was in Rialto, we actually had an officer working for that task force. But they were there to serve. It was the local office of the FBI, but that's where that JTTF was located at. And so you might come into contact with them because they're a little bit kind of more of a street level type organization. So now let's move on to the CIA. Well, that's it. I can't tell you anything because it's a secret. No, I'm kidding. But it is, they do have a lot of secrets. Okay, so the framework for the U.S., for U.S. intelligence was created in a different time to deal with different problems other than terrorism. The National Security Act of 1947, which established the CIA, envisioned the enemies of the U.S., at that time, remember, we're back in 1947, right, to be nation states like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. The result was organizations and authority based on strict distinctions between domestic versus foreign threats, law enforcement versus national security concerns, and peacetime versus wartime operations. Now, out of this, and where we're at kind of right now, the FBI was given responsibility for domestic intelligence inside the U.S. And the CIA was charged with developing foreign intelligence outside of the U.S. So if you were to think of this logically, the FBI, they're going to be the first ones to respond to a domestic terrorism incident from the federal government. But when you talk about intel, FBI was given responsibility for domestic, local, United States, intel inside the U.S., and the CIA was charged with the same thing, gathering intel, but outside of the U.S. And, the CIA's mission was basically, or is basically, threefold. The first is to stop activities from terrorist organizations and nation states that threaten the United States. So that would be one. And it, if you want to kind of add a little bit more, or any U.S. interests abroad by collecting intel information vital to U.S. decision makers. Number 2, to conduct effective covert actions against enemies of the United States as directed by the president. And then 3, to safeguard national secrets that maintain the security of the United States. So, kind of interesting, but those are the 3, the missions of the CIA. Within the CIA, as we kind of finish up their portion here, we have the National Clandestine Service. And this was formerly known as the Directorate of Operations. And this is a major part of the structure of the CIA, this National Clandestine Service. And it is the operation wing that carries out covert paramilitary operations against terrorist groups and cells outside of the United States. It is also the part of the CIA that is often, or that is most often, kind of depicted in the popular media, with the CIA agent overseas, conducting all these types of operations in different countries, if you will, right? So it's depicted like that. Now recently, however, the CIA has shifted focus from traditional counterterrorism activities to also cyber intelligence and more, offensive cyber operations. So they're becoming a little more proactive, if you will, as it relates to cyber operations. So the CIA is also focused on cyber intel. Okay, and then we're going to talk about the FBI, but here's kind of a chart that shows you the difference. So even though we're going to jump into the FBI next, maybe I should have saved this slide for later, but here we are. You can see CIA on the left, the FBI on the right. Here's what, each group is called, what it stands for, when it was formed, the employees, where the headquarters is located, their websites, their annual budget. Okay, so kind of interesting. CIA, their annual budget, classified. That means it's a secret. So remember, we talked about secrets. Okay, so now the FBI. So the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, headquartered in Washington, D.C. at the J. Edgar Hoover Building, the FBI is the largest investigative agency in the Department of Justice. It represents the nation's premier law enforcement agency, and it has 2 distinct missions relating to terrorism. The first is they are the primary criminal investigative body on any terrorist attack against the United States, domestic and international. So you're probably saying, well, I thought the CIA was international. Well, that was for gathering intel, that covert stuff. But when you talk about an actual terrorist attack, the FBI, they are the primary investigative body on any terrorist attack against the U.S., domestic and international. And then second, the FBI basically collects, analyzes, and disseminates all domestic intelligence information relating to terrorist threats. Now, you don't see international on there because remember, as far as intel goes, the FBI does domestic and the CIA, remember, does what? International. Kind of confusing, but I think you're getting the hang of it. So with that being said, the FBI is a intel-driven or intelligence-driven type organization, meaning that it combines investigation and intelligence operations to be more predictive and preventative in nature. They're more aware of emerging trends and threats and better able to keep them from occurring. So the primary vehicle for the collection of intelligence. When I say vehicle, I mean like mechanism. For the collection of intelligence relating to terrorism for the FBI, remember we talked about it, is the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And I talked about how there was one local in Riverside County that the city I worked in, Rialto, we would use that one. So the FBI, they manage those JTTFs, or those Joint Terrorism Task Force units. And these task forces are based in 102 cities nationwide. They have a little over 4,200 members in 600 state and local agencies and 50 federal agencies. And as I mentioned, departments can actually have one of their own officers become part of these task forces. And then you have a direct liaison. Rialto, we had an individual on the JTTF because we thought it was important to be involved in issues relating to terrorism, et cetera, in our community. So we put an officer on the task force. And some, there was an officer, I think, from Redlands, one from San Bernardino. So you get different officers from different agencies on these task forces. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms that are used in combating terrorism. And the slide kind of talks about, or the caption here is, blurred lines and conflicting roles. Because there are a couple of things that law enforcement agencies might use that seem to be, kind of a fine line on whether or not we think it might be appropriate. Now, a lot of these mechanisms are extremely appropriate and they're needed, but let's talk about them and you can kind of draw your own conclusion as we go through this. So the FBI and local and state police agencies within this country have a different role than the CIA, one that focuses, on crime most committed by citizens within the United States. Now, with the passage of the USA Patriot Act in 2001, the hard and fast distinctions between the FBI and the CIA, and hence the role of the police in combating terrorism, have become somewhat blurred, if you will. Law enforcement's primary focus has been to collect evidence after a crime was committed in order to support prosecution in a court trial. And this process, is called investigation. It is typically, reactive in nature. And traditionally, police intelligence activity has been severely limited by law. So we're going to talk about a couple of things that might seem a little controversial, but I think you'll agree with me that they're necessary. So on October 8th, 2001, President George W. Bush signed into law the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. Man, I know that's a lot. Or the USA Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act allowed certain things. And I have a video, if you want to watch the Patriot Act, about it. So the Patriot Act does some things. First of all, it allows law enforcement to use tools that are already available to fight terrorism. It also facilitates information sharing. It updates some of the laws. It also allows your intelligence and information gathering to reflect new technologies and new threats. And it also increases the penalties for those who commit or support terrorist crimes. So, again, you have a lot of things that you can do with the Patriot Act. So this Patriot Act, it gives police, law enforcement, unprecedented ability to search, seize, detain, and listen in or eavesdrop in their pursuit of terrorists. And to me, that's reasonable. And the law expanded, this Patriot Act also expanded the FBI's wiretapping and electronic surveillance authority. And it also allowed nationwide jurisdiction for search warrants and electronic surveillance, meaning you can't, they can get a search warrant for some place in another country. So we're talking, it's nationwide, if you will. So one interesting aspect of the Patriot Act is that it has a sunset clause, or something that's easier to understand, an expiration date. So if you recall, when was it signed in? We'll back up for you. October 8th, 2001. So now we'll go back up. So President Obama, when this act expired, or sunset clause, if you will, signed a 4-year extension of the USA Patriot Act on May 26, 2011. And it kept a lot of the provisions there, but it also kind of enhanced 3 key provisions. It allowed for what we call roving wiretaps, or the enhancement of these. It also allowed greater surveillance capabilities of lone wolf terrorist suspects, because we know from reading in previous chapters they're very difficult to track, because operationally they tend to work by themselves, right? So we need other mechanisms to help us do that. And it also expanded searches to business records. But there were some avenues that we were allowed to do, but this was kind of an expansion of searches into individuals' business records. Now, again, remember, there were some sunset clause things here. So, enacted on June 2nd, 2015, was the USA Freedom Act. So, after the second time, or the expiration, if you will, that we just talked about, of the USA Patriot Act, came the USA Freedom Act. So, enacted on June 2nd, 2015, this USA Freedom Act restored in modified forms many of the provisions that were already there in the Patriot Act. Now, some things that it did is that it did impose some limitations on the collection of bulk data, or certain metadata or telecommunications information, and there were some other small limitations as well. But that was one of the biggest ones, where it had some limits on the collection of this type of telecommunications metadata. And if you want to know a little bit more about the USA Freedom Act, I have a link to a video, and you can take a look there. Okay, so the FBI and local state police agencies within this country, again, as I stated earlier, they have a different role. And with the passage of this USA Patriot Act, and then subsequently the USA Freedom Act, the hard and fast distinctions between the FBI and CIA, and hence the role of the police in combating terrorism, it kind of got blurred a little bit. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to you. Because police could not act without probable cause, which is typically how we can act in certain stages, in certain stages of an investigation, but were prevented from activities that could establish probable cause. Now, the Patriot Act now allows FBI and police to engage in covert intelligence operations, some without warrants, justified by the need to prevent terrorist attacks and gather terrorist information. And one of those interesting things, before we kind of move on, is something called a sneak and peek warrant. And I have a video there, and I would really suggest that you watch it, but this is interesting. So, officially called a delayed notice warrant, or a covert entry warrant, it is in fact a search warrant authorizing law enforcement officers that are executing it, those that are executing the warrant, to basically make physical entry into a private premise without the owner's or the occupant's permission or knowledge, and to secretly, which is clandestinely, search the premise. And usually such an entry requires, kind of breaking, etc. Search the premise, find or not find what they're looking for, not leave a receipt for the individual if they take something, and then leave. Now, there's a little bit more to it because they're going to follow that up, but it's kind of a warrant that allows you to go in to kind of prove whether or not you think what's going on is going on. Does that kind of make sense? But when you're talking about terrorist activities, do you think this might be something that is called for? Again, it's that blurred line kind of thing. But watch the video and you tell me what you think. Super interesting. And then I just kind of put in here, the difference, between an investigation versus intelligence. That we have a little bit of, context on the two words. All right, so finally finishing up on this portion, impacts of the Fourth Amendment of unwarranted searches and seizures and illegal intrusions, into privacy without probable cause. There are impacts and there are issues. So we just have to be aware of, are these things necessary? And I actually put the Fourth Amendment in here if you don't know what it says. Okay, so now let's move on to, let's talk a little bit about the National Security Agency. Actually, I'm just kind of checking ahead for a second to see how much more we have. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. So the National Security Agency, or the NSA, bills itself as the nation's, basically the preeminent cryptologic organization. Now, in more familiar language, the NSA is primarily responsible for designing and maintaining computerized coding systems designed to protect the integrity of the U.S. information systems, right? So people can't hack into them. And it also monitors all federal government's computer networks for cyber terrorism, etc. So, it's also become the lead agency responsible for, protecting the government's computers. Now, in direct relation to these responsibility, NSA agents are also responsible for detecting and exploiting weaknesses in an adversarial country's computerized secret coding system. So they're kind of like in charge of being able to look at different weaknesses to their systems. And headquartered in Fort Meade, Maryland, the NSA has been providing the nation with code-breaking capabilities since these operations began against the Japanese in the Pacific theater of World War II. So, one of the interesting characters that was a former NSA individual, and now, people call him different things actually, would be Edward Snowden. He's a former NSA contractor who basically disclosed classified NSA documents to the media. And I have a couple of interesting, and he's on the run right now, and I have a couple interesting videos on what he did and basically why he said that he did it. So, kind of an interesting thing. We don't have a lot of time to jump into that, but if you want to take the time to look at that, you can. Now, when we talk about intelligence and cyber terrorism, teams from the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA, they work together in a secure location known as the Remote Operations Center, or the ROC, R-O-C. With overlapping missions and legal authorities combined with the best high technology equipment available, these teams have basically a dual mission, if you will. And the first is cyber defense. So to protect U.S. military and intelligence systems and our critical infrastructures. And number two would be the cyber offense, meaning offensive, and not like being mean offensive, meaning like go on the offense. So to covertly, secretly, exploit and infiltrate, get into foreign systems to advance the interests of the United States. And let's be honest for a minute. If you don't think all of these different huge government agencies in different countries, if you don't think they spy on each other, you're sadly mistaken, because everybody is trying to protect their own stuff. And sometimes in order to do that, you need to not only be on the defense, but you need to be on the offense. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. So, these two missions provide a strong base in which to combat cyber terrorism, or what we call digital terrorism. So now we're going to kind of define these two. So cyber terrorism or digital terrorism is the premeditated, and if you don't know what that means the planned, politically or ideologically motivated attack against information networks, computer systems, or programs that can result in violence against civilian targets. And, there are various definitions, or various definitions exist, and some include, an economic loss, or, what we call hacktivism. It's kind of an interesting word, which is the spreading of a particular belief. So, this kind of muddies the water. So, to muddy the waters on all this, cyber terrorism, digital terrorism, a less significant activity designed to, protest the spread of truth, or otherwise emphasize a particular belief or political, bent, if you will, without intentional harm to human life, is referred to a hacktivism, or, he's a hacktivist, or she. And in these cases, they mostly involve, website defacement. And the actor is involved much more in vandalism and chaos versus economic gain and or destruction. So it's kind of like terrorism without a body count, if that makes any sense. So the next agency we're going to talk about quickly, and we're going to run through a bunch of them really quick. So again, we have a lot of them to cover, but there's not a lot of information on each one. So the Defense Intelligence Agency. This agency provides intelligence in support of U.S. military planning and operations. They're the primary agency, for the Department of Defense. This agency houses the Office of the Inspector General, and it focuses on the prevention of surprise attacks. Now, the DIA also conducts security background investigations on all military or defense personnel relating to security clearances. So whether or not you have, in the military and in some, agencies, they have levels of security clearance, top secret, blah, blah, blah. So this agency, these are the folks that do the backgrounds. Then you have the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And this agency uses maps or imagery, charts, and satellite data intelligence. They use, high-level geographic information systems, or GIS systems, remote sensing, critical in relation to terrain, elevation, and gravity, which allow for strategic and tactical advantage. So basically mapping, and that's kind of what geospatial means. You have the National Reconnaissance Office, responsible for designing, building, launching, maintaining, and monitoring America's satellite system. So once they're up there, who's responsible for keeping an eye on them? Well, that would be the NRO. You have the State Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Their mission is to provide intelligence information in support of U.S. diplomacy. Provides intelligence support for the safety and security of our embassies located throughout the world. You have the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, or INA. And this is an agency that manages the collection, analysis, and dissemination of intelligence through the entire Department of Homeland Security. It integrates intelligence elements within the DHS, and it shares information with state and local governments. And I told you, there's a lot of agencies, right, that fall underneath those 16 that we talked about. You have the National Criminal Intelligence Sharing Plan. This combines public partnership concepts of community policing with problem-solving tactics to enhance police efficiency and draw attention to preventing terrorist attacks through effective communication and coordination. And some, even local agencies have really cool things. I've seen one thing locally in Redlands. It's called See Something, Say Something. Well, that would fall underneath this if it were related to terrorism, right? So that could be something you could actually use at an airport. Then you have an interesting concept called intelligence-led policing. And this is something that it's a real thing, you guys, and it's basically the reliance of computers and data to assist police in decision making in their daily, their everyday duties, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the emphasis of intelligence-led policing. So by definition, it's a new style of policing that integrates intelligence with an emphasis of, or on predictive analysis derived from the discovery of data and facts, information, patterns, and good old traditional crime analysis. That's intelligence-led policing. So, we're going to talk now, and we're just about done, so I don't think we need to go into a second lecture. We're going to take a very quick look at the intelligence process and what they call the intel cycle. So local police switch from a react and respond to, to past calls for service to an emphasis on predictive analysis derived from facts, information, patterns, intelligence, and good crime analysis. Remember, I talked a little bit about that in intelligence-led policing, right? You need source reliability and something to be able to validate the information. And this is gleaned or obtained through a universal process called the intelligence cycle. And sometimes it's tweaked a little bit depending upon exactly who you're talking to, but there are 6 basic steps. One is, requirements are identified information needs, meaning that what do we need to know to safeguard the nation? Number 2, planning and direction is a management of the entire effort from identifying the need for information to delivering the intelligence to the consumer. Number 3, collection is the gathering of raw information based on requirements and includes interviews, surveillance, searches, and liaison relationships. Number 4, processing and exploitation involves converting the information collected into a form of usable information by decryption, translation, or data reduction. Number 5, analysis and production is the conversion of raw information into intelligence. Reliability, validity, and relevance, they're all weighed. And then finally 6, dissemination is the distribution of raw or finished intelligence to the consumer through reports, bulletins, and assessments. And I think I have a picture of it. Maybe I don't. I thought I did. But those 6 different steps, again, so you have, requirements is one. You have planning and direction. You have collection. You have processing. And then you have, analysis and production and dissemination. So you have those different steps, and I kind of went over each one. So now we're going to finish up talking about fusion centers. And then I think we'll have one more just quick thing on DHS and we'll be done. So fusion centers, they involve the transformation of state and local police agencies into these intelligence-led organizations. A fusion center, it's a clearinghouse or an information hub that blends the power of information, technology with terrorism prevention and also crime fighting. So it kind of brings all of these, components together. So it's this transformation of state, local agencies into like one agency to create, kind of a task and coordinating process, and then developing core intelligence that produces, produces things that are going to lead that operation, and then you're going to establish the different training practices, and then you're going to have the protocols. But anyway, by definition, a fusion center is that clearinghouse or that information hub. And typically, it's not just one agency. You'll have people from several agencies working together in these fusion centers. And so using that technology, they're able to come up with information and synthesize and process that information and get it out very, very quickly. So what are some of the key objectives? Well, one objective, again, is the creation of a task and coordination process. Number two, development of a core intelligence product to lead to operation. Number three, establishment of standardized training practices. And number four, development of protocols to facilitate intelligence capabilities. And those are fusion centers. But, they help respond to terrorist threats, and they also deal with regular crime. And it also blends community partnerships with police accountability. So on the left picture here, you can see New York PD's Fusion Center dealing with counterterrorism, but they also deal with criminal activity as well. One concept of a fusion center was launched in New York City in 2002. They called it a real-time crime center, but in essence, it's a fusion center. It distributes relevant, actionable, and timely information and intelligence vertically through agencies, so local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, and horizontally through other response agencies like fire, EMS, and public works. So it keeps everybody in the know. And, again, we know that they act as a central host for information and analysis, but they're also a conduit for passing on information. And you can see the map there. It doesn't identify each state, but you can see almost every state and several states have many fusion centers. And then just what they provide, they support a broad range of activities. They aid in, protection of critical infrastructure. They also are the maintenance piece of public tip lines, and they assist, or they provide assistance for police executives by using data, and which helps them make certain decisions. Okay, so then finally DHS and fusion centers, and then we're done. So the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has played an integral role in the development and implementation of fusion centers as part of the intelligence-led policing paradigm that we've talked about. And the primary goal of DHS in this area has been to promote a strong relationship between state and local and federal law enforcement agencies through financial grants. That's one way that they do it. And many states and larger cities have created fusion centers to share information and intelligence with their jurisdictions, as well as with federal government agencies funded through these DHS different grants. So, DHS also provides these fusion centers, with support personnel. And there's a couple of them that we're going to talk about. So as of 2017, there were 78 primary and recognized state and major urban fusion centers within the U.S. A primary fusion center typically provides information collection, collation, analysis, and sharing for an entire state, while a recognized fusion center typically provides services for a major urban area, so a large city. And almost every state has a statewide fusion center, as do most major urban areas. So the National Fusion Center Association is a formal group that represents the interests of state and major urban area fusion centers. In addition to that, the NFCA provides the development and basically sustainment of fusion centers to enhance public safety and the ethical and lawful collection of intelligence gathering, analysis, and then finally dissemination of information. And like many federal agencies, and individual fusion centers, the goal of the NFCA is to prevent the next terrorist attack on our homeland. Now, the Homeland Security Data Network, or the HSDN, because there's an acronym for everything, right? Which allows the federal government to move information and intelligence, to the states, at the secret level, is deployed at most of these different fusion centers. All right, I know that was a lot of information, but we made it just a hair over our 60-minute mark, but that's okay. Again, you don't have to remember every single agency in there because there's just no way you're going to do that. Just try to remember the larger ones. And then also, just as a reference, on page 263 in your textbook, there was a list of primary fusion centers and then also recognized fusion centers if by chance you're interested. So with that, that's going to conclude our Chapter 9 lecture on intelligence and terrorism.